Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Rosenthal. I'm the director of the Petrarch Institute. I'm here with co-founder Miles Smith. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. I'm Miles Smith. I know Alex for many years from school, and we're embarking on today the first podcast from the Petrarch Institute. Alex, did you want to tell us a little bit about what the Petrarch Institute is and what it does?
Sure. So basically, the Petrarch Institute is effectively an online school. We call it the Renaissance School for the 20th century, or 21st century, or Miles likes to call it a Noah's Ark for the humanities, where we basically are hosting courses in the classical humanities tradition online for interested persons throughout the world. So that's essentially what we do. Is there anything else that comes to mind that we should tell you?
I guess we have a couple of ways of pursuing community in terms of people who want to learn a bit more, people who want to share ideas, and people who want to explore new ways of communicating through latter-day educational tools some of the themes and educational ideas that are prevalent in the classical era. Would you say that's about right?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess we can introduce today's theme, right? So like we said, what the Petrarch Institute is largely involved in is this idea of classical humanism, classical education. It's a theme which has been central to the whole development and continuity of Western culture for centuries. But we get to the basic question of what is the classical? What does classical mean, right? How does it relate to modernity? What is its value, and so forth? So that's sort of the theme we'll be discussing today.
How about that first theme, Alex? Education is something you see on billboards, on the subway, on buses, everywhere, offering new ways to learn, things that will help you in your career, things that will help you in your life. So with an eye to what we can learn from the classics, what they have to teach us, how they're similar to us, how they might be different, what would you say is quintessential in the classical notion of education?
All right, well, very good. Okay, so I think the Greeks are kind of an interesting culture because on the one hand, they're kind of with us today in many of the ways that we conceive things. They're sort of foundational to Western thought. But on the other hand, they lived an awfully long time ago. So there are going to be distinctive aspects to their way of thinking, which won't necessarily be obvious or evident to us. The Greek form of education, which was the Greek educational and cultural ideal, which was quite distinctive from the other cultures and forms of education which have existed throughout the world, right? So we could think of, in terms of common forms of education, one obvious one would be a technical kind of education, or what we today would call vocational education, right? Which would basically be learning a skill set for a career or whatever, At the basic, you could think of just something as simple as learning the tools of the trade for farming or blacksmithing, and that, of course, has gone on in all cultures throughout history. Another common form of education in the ancient world was religious forms of education. The priestly classes were often the literate classes, right? And so education was focused on the study of sacred texts by a priesthood. The Greek form of education was called paideia, and it had a different aim from either of those. I think Werner Jaeger had a very elegant phrase about paideia. He called it the education of man to his true form, right? So the idea is that there is kind of an ideal of man. Human beings have all of these potencies, and paideia is meant to realize or perfect the potencies of human beings in all spheres, right? So at that time it included the physical, gymnastics and so forth, right? Perfecting man's physical form, but also, and most importantly for us, perfecting the moral and the intellectual faculties. And should I say a little something about the history of paideia?
I think that might be interesting for people. It's just something that not everyone knows a lot about, but it helps maybe explain how we got where we are, whatever that is.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just very, very briefly outline a little bit. Okay, so paideia gets and this included things like philosophy, poetry, rhetoric, and all these sorts of things. So it gets it gets translated into Latin as humanitas, right, which means humanity. And you had figures like Cicero, who more or less adapted Greek paideia to the Roman world, and this is called humanitas. And it became central to the formation of educated Romans, right? Then with the fall of the Roman Empire, elements of paideia survive in, say, for example, in the monastic communities, right? Although knowledge of Greek, which was part of the Roman education, was largely lost, sort of humanitas, right? It became in the forms of the trivium and the quadrivium, part of the liberal arts education, first of monks, and then when universities were formed as part of the faculty of arts in the Middle Ages. And then during the Renaissance, there was sort of a full-throated revival, right, including the revival of Greek. And what I think is also important is during the Renaissance, it became not merely preparatory toward theology or other professional capacities within the church, but something that laymen got involved in. So it you know, we could say the liberal arts or the humanistic education became a lay activity, and from there it was eventually incorporated into everything from what we think of like the English public schools, right? The English, which were really private schools, the German gymnasia. It was central in the United States in the early universities and schooling and so forth, right? So we're really talking about a tradition that goes back perhaps to the 5th century BC, which really marks the entire continuity of the Western educational tradition. And it's really only recently that it's been, you know, in a certain level of crisis, we could say. But that's a different topic.
There's a couple of interesting points there, Alex. One of them, I think, that some of the listeners may have picked up on is this idea of vehicles or channels or tools of education by which there's continuity in terms of how we educate and how we break out subjects and how we approach a hierarchy of formation that runs more or less unbroken from the ancient world through what we sometimes think of as the Dark Ages to today. So that may bring a second question to the mind of the audience, which is, you know, is our focus a bit different today? For example, is our focus on technical information or on the instrumental use of learning different from that which was originally formed under this rubric of paideia or humanitas? Is there something about knowledge for its own sake which has changed or in some ways been lost?
Yeah, well, that's a good point, right? So Edmund Husserl, the famous philosopher, spoke about the peculiarity of the Greeks as this thing called the theoretical attitude, right? And this was another way in which the Greeks broke from the way in which most other people conceived knowledge, right? So, for example, geometry had existed long before the Greeks, right? I mean, the ancient Egyptians used geometry for surveying and for architecture, right? So, but it's knowledge subordinated to a practical purpose, right? What you get with the Greeks are things like, you know, Euclid's Elements, right? Systematic effort to understand the foundations of mathematics, right? So it's this idea of knowledge as being a good in itself, right? The quest for knowledge for its own sake. And so on the one hand, that is core. I would not want to say that humanistic education was viewed as simply useless, right? Because the idea was, if we develop humanity, if we perfect all the different faculties that human beings have, moral, intellectual, our capacity for aesthetic appreciation, this person will be perhaps the most useful person of all, right? Who has the fullest possible development of human faculties. But at the same time, there is an idea throughout the Paidean humanist tradition that knowledge and wisdom have their own intrinsic value. And it is, I think, generally recognized that our notions of education have switched to a much more technical focus, right? How do I learn the particular skill sets that I need to perform the particular job that I want to do? So one could ask whether there's a certain loss in terms of, well, the paideia is really a universal education, right? I mean, it's really an education to sort of think and do all things. I mean, that's sort of the, it sounds grandiose, but that's sort of the ideal. The Renaissance called it the universal man, right?
Right.
That seems to have been largely lost in favor of technical functionaries, right? The trying to, educating people to become functionaries performing a particular task. So I think it's probably fair. I mean, framing it dramatically, but I think it's probably fair to say there have been strong trends in that direction.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I'm hearing an interesting distinction there between the instrumental approach, which is to teach people things that will help achieve certain ends, and on the other hand, an education that takes an incomplete person and makes them complete, or at least more complete.
Yes, exactly. So this was the idea of, fulfilling one's humanity, right? This is why it's called humanism, we could say. Now, there have always been tensions within the humanist tradition in terms of how paideia, I'm talking about within the human, how it should be defined, right? What are the most important things? Well, for example, the main practical focus, which can also be put under the rubric of humanism, the main practical focus in both ancient Greece, in Rome, and during the Renaissance would be on rhetoric, right? Because these were societies in which the path to power was not, well, in a monarchy you don't really need rhetoric, right? But in the case of the citizen, the free citizen, the path to success is going to involve persuasion. And so you have the rhetorical school, which strongly emphasized the idea that a humanistic education was important even on the level of success, right? Being persuasive in one's speaking and knowing a great deal about a great many topics, so you could speak on any subject. And that was in some competition historically with the more, we could say, idealistic philosophical notion that you kind of sketched out about this theoretical attitude, right? Just wisdom for its own sake. So there are those interesting tensions within the tradition as well.
Maybe there's another tension there that will be of some interest to the audience. So if anyone out there has the very limited Greek that I do, you hear the word paideia and you think about a word like pediatrics, so something that is oriented towards children. The idea of paideia, as you've outlined it, makes one think of working on or developing the little ones, bringing them up. So
Exactly.
is there a distinction there that's interesting between the purposes, the usefulness, the intrinsic merit of education in this classical understanding for the individual on the one hand and for society as a whole on the other? Now, right. So you're absolutely right about the etymology of paideia, right? So we could kind of think of it as the forming of children, right? So, but I mean, obviously, paideia continues, long after childhood. There really is no complete end to it, right? And so, like at the beginning, from early childhood, right, you would have on the one hand, from childhood, you would have on the one hand body culture, gymnastics, and soul culture, which had been focused on poetry. But you're right to talk about this issue of the individual and the community, right? What is the relationship there? So essentially, the Greeks viewed the person who had achieved excellence, right? Arete, excellence, right? Who had developed their moral and intellectual faculties,
as well as the civic importance of things like rhetoric, that this person would be the most useful to the community, right? So there is the idea that the individual is developing, but that the development of the individual is not contrary, right? But is in fact serving the good of the community as a whole. So now in the Renaissance is talked about as the period famously as I think it was Petrarch, the discovery of the individual. So there's a stronger emphasis, I would say, in the Renaissance on the individual, even above and beyond the community. So those are things that one could think about in more detail. So, what were you trying to get at, sort of?
Well, no, I just think it's an interesting question of where does the virtue lie when education is a good in itself? I mean, does it aim foremost at the creation of good individuals, or does it aim at the perfection of society, or are those two things in concert? Do they come together through optimal education, or is that a sort of running fight within what we might call, under one term, this classical tradition, this humanistic tradition?
Yeah, I would say very much it is an internal conflict, right? So the notion that you get in Plato, right, is that theoretical knowledge and ethical knowledge, right, are really almost one and the same thing, right? He's famous for this idea that virtue is knowledge, right?
Right.
So that the acquisition of intellectual understanding of what it is to live a good life is more or less identical with, what is requisite to actually live a good life, right? So the moral virtues and the theoretical virtues are not fully distinguished in the Platonic version. Now, in Aristotle, you get the tension comes through, right? Because he distinguishes the intellectual from the moral virtues in Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, right? So on the one hand, he says in the Politics, right, that the human being outside of the polis, right, outside of the community, is either greater than humanity or below humanity, right? Because he says man is naturally a political animal, man is naturally meant to live in communities. But yet, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, he talks about, well, why is the theoretical life, why is a life of theoretical excellence, right, the highest kind of life? Because it's so self-sufficient, right? You need the community less, right? So it's almost pointing to something which is beyond the polis, beyond the community. So yeah, I think that tension is definitely there, right, between education for the good of the community, developing the individual for the good of the community, and this idea of wisdom or knowledge as being an end in and of itself, which in a way sort of individualizes the person above and beyond the community, right?
Absolutely. Well, Alex, I think that's a very nice appetizer for a subject that could be spun out for hours and hours, and in the coming weeks and months, we expect it will be. Where can people find more of what we do?
Yes, so our website, which you'll find on this YouTube channel on our Google Plus page, and just directly www.petrarch-institute.com. You can find more information on the Petrarch Institute, as well as who we are and our upcoming courses.
Absolutely. You can also find interaction and updates at Petrarch Center on Twitter, and we'll let you know about upcoming podcasts there.
Excellent. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope you'll stay tuned for more videos from the Petrarch Institute.